In the 9th century AD and following, religious leaders and thinkers, like Benedict, suggested that the true way to holiness or to closeness with God was to withdraw and remove from a sinful world. Benedict suggested that people should gather in communities and live with strict rules and frequent opportunities to worship and praise God. Such communities, like monasteries and abbeys, spent their days with ordered times of worship services called offices. They also had other rules, such as a rule that you couldn't speak except for only necessary purposes or in praise of God. In monasteries, often they would fast or at least eat a regulated diet, very little meat, very straightforward, with none of the excesses of feasting that we would see periodically during the secular medieval year. One extreme example of such seclusion is that of the anchorage or hermitage, where 1 or 2 or 3 devotees end up being walled into a room and spend their entire life not only withdrawn from the world, but withdrawn from even the religious community in which they reside. At the age of 9, Hildegard, the 10th child of noble parents, was given to an abbey as an oblate, that is, a devotion to God. By the age of 14, she had taken holy orders, and with her supervisor, a young woman only 6 years her elder, named Jutta, she was walled into a cell or chamber in an anchorage, there to spend the next 24 years in contemplation and devotion to God. This seclusion certainly seems extreme to us, especially in the 21st century, and in America, where we're accustomed to come and go as we please. However, this was seen as the way of removing any temptations of the outside world, and the religious or monastic life in general for women was also seen not as just a removal of temptation to sin, but as a certain amount of protection. It wasn't uncommon for a widow to withdraw to an abbey later in life simply because it was a safe place to live. Jutta, the anchoress with whom Hildegard was immured, was an extreme devotee. She experienced and inflicted upon herself many of the ascetic rigors that the more fanatical of the monastics used, fasting to the point of fainting. She even wound a chain around herself so that the pain of her flesh would remind her of the salvation of her soul. Hildegard seems to have been more balanced in her religious fervor and in her outlook on life, while Jutta was unwilling even to eat meat when she was so sick that she was fainting. Hildegard writes later that a balanced diet is the healthiest one. Indeed, her writings on diet reflect sort of contemporary thought on what humans should eat when they want to be healthy. Hildegard's time in the chamber with Jutta ended at Jutta's death. After Jutta died, Hildegard came forth and was elected to be in charge of the abbey or priory, the community of nuns in which she had lived secluded for 24 years. This seems to be a mark of recognition of her great intellect. You may wonder, how did they know that she had intellect if she had been walled in a chamber for 24 years? Well, clearly there was some communication from within the chamber to the outer abbey world. First of all, there would have had to have been a way to pass in food and pass out things like chamber pots and laundry and things that needed to be done. But the contact was limited. Hildegard's 24 years spent in contemplation were not only to devote herself to God, but it allowed her to reflect mentally, without telling anyone else, on something that had afflicted her since childhood, namely visions. She writes later, after she's become head of the priory or the abbey, that from a young age she had been given to seeing things, and she finally realized that no one else could see the things she was seeing. As a child, this was extremely frightening. When she asked her nurse, "Do you see this?" and the nurse said, "There's nothing there." Hildegard, like many other visionaries of the time, kept these visions to herself, not sure what they meant, afraid to let on to anyone else that she was seeing these strange things. Not only were these visions themselves visually scary, she also heard voices speaking. And these visions were accompanied with physical illness and a period of immobility or strange paralysis. All in all, a frightening thing. It wasn't until she was in her 40s that Hildegard took courage and was able to write down the visions, and not just what she saw, but what they meant. Reflecting back, she writes about one of those visions. "I saw an extremely strong, sparkling, fiery light coming from the open heavens. It pierced my brain, my heart, and my breast through and through like a flame, which did not burn. However, it warmed me. It heated me up very much like the sun warms an object on which it is pouring out rays. And suddenly I had an insight into the meaning and interpretation of the Psalter, the Gospel, and other Catholic writings of the Old and New Testaments, but not into the meaning of the sentence structure and the hyphenation. Also, I had no understanding of the events of the times." In this reminiscence, Hildegard is doing two things. She's telling us what she saw and suddenly the meaning that became attached to these visions, but she's also sort of pacifying herself as an unlearned religious woman. Indeed, she lamented her whole life that she had not had proper formal training. Yet, in company with several other female religious mystics of the Middle Ages, the outpouring of visions and her own explanations of the meanings of these visions give a voice to a woman in a religious world that's dominated by patriarchal hierarchy. It's the one way the passive voice of the woman can be heard in the midst of the cloister. Hildegard began writing about her visions. That is, she began writing about them with the help of a secretary, a monk named Volmer, who had spent much of his earlier career writing down the life of the blessed Jutta, the anchoress with whom Hildegard had been immured. Volmer simply switched employers, you could say. His association with Hildegard lasted the rest of both of their lives, and Volmer faithfully wrote down all that Hildegard said, putting it into the context of books of writings. Hildegard didn't simply dictate the words to Volmer. She also created images, poetry, and music. Volmer was writing it down and potentially adding some commentary on the side, but the visions themselves and the allegorical meanings of those visions belong to Hildegard. She was an extremely prolific writer, with writing in the 1140s, writing her book Scivias, or Knowings, a record, both visual art and writings, of these visions that she had seen. She also spent years writing a sort of biology text or compendium of natural things, plants, animals, stones, trees, flowers. Perhaps one of the first female biologists. She also spent time in correspondence with religious leaders, with other women in the church and out of it who sought her advice, and with other religious visionaries. Her output is so impressive that one wonders how she found time to fit it into what must have been a rather busy life administering the religious community of an abbey.